Founded in 1917, West London Action for Children provides free counselling and therapy for vulnerable children and families in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They provide individual therapy to children, young people and parents, family therapy, as well as groups for parents, children, dads, and mindfulness groups. They also run a stay and play group weekly. As we all know, the COVID-19 outbreak has had a significant and devastating impact on many children, teenagers, and families. Feelings of isolation, health, and social anxiety for many of the clients of West London Action for Children have been exacerbated. Many of the clients were already facing significant challenges, emotional, psychological, things like poverty already before COVID-19. But COVID-19 has really had a significant and devastating impact for many, many children and families. Things like poor quality housing, poverty, complex relational problems, all of these have been made so much more difficult by the whole COVID-19 crisis. The lockdown has traumatized children. Many of the children I've met myself and spoken to in the course of my work have described really significant feelings of anxiety, of fear, absolute fear and terror sometimes. And West London Action for Children's work in ameliorating and restoring children to well-being has never been more vital. But sadly, a lot of the work hasn't been able to take place during this time. So they've had to repurpose and think of new ways. And their therapists who would have been running many of the groups have been able to optimize their caseload by taking new clients on and supporting them one-to-one through the internet instead. They've reached out to parents with an online mindfulness group, and they're about to start an online parenting group for fathers. So I'm going to introduce Eleanor Mills in a minute, but as you're thinking of questions, use the Q&A button, not the chat function, Q&A to submit questions as Eleanor is talking. I'm going to introduce Eleanor Mills now. Eleanor joined the Sunday Times in 1998 as the youngest ever features editor, became editor of the Saturday edition of the Times in 2008, and then returned to the Sunday Times as associate editor and columnist a year later. She's been the editorial director since June 2012. She became editor of the Sunday Times magazine in 2015. Under Eleanor's editorship, the magazine won Supplement of the Year at the Press Awards for the first time in its history. She left the newspaper in March 2020, but remains chair of Women in Journalism and makes regular TV appearances. In this webinar, Eleanor's going to talk about the highlights of her career as a journalist, including her exclusive Theresa May interview, editor and campaigner against FGM, the pornification of teens online, and about shining a light on poverty in the Broadwater Farm Estate and in Blackpool. And if that wasn't enough, all of that, how to use storytelling to raise funds for and awareness for important causes. So over to you, Eleanor. We'll be delighted to listen to you tonight.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. It's such a great cause and something that I'm really delighted to be here to talk about. So Laurence has told you a bit about me, just to show that I'm not making it up. I'm gonna try and hang on a second. Let's just, oh gosh, here we go. Let's get the right thing on the Zoom. Here we are. Hooray! It worked. So this is today's talk, and I've worked for the Sunday Times for nearly 20 years, and my kind of sign-off interview earlier this year, I went to Palo Alto in California to go and interview Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, which was quite a dramatic trip. It was just as lots of the Facebook scandal was breaking, and they were pretty aware that they were going to have some problems on the advertiser front. It was slightly before all the George Floyd stuff, but it was fascinating to go to California and Silicon Valley, which is so often seen as real kind of center of the world. And actually, when you get there, it feels quite parochial. And I'm happy to tell you that the Facebook office feels a bit like a kind of IKEA off a bypass in Slough. It was really not very glamorous and not really that impressive. One of the other highlights of my career is while I was editor of the magazine, I didn't always send myself off to do cover interviews, but I only did them occasionally. I started off at the Sunday Times as the paper's main interviewer, and I went to interview Theresa May, which was one of the first interviews that she'd ever done for a magazine. So she'd done the odd kind of more short political interview. This was meant to be getting to know Theresa May, the woman. And I have to confess, it was not the easiest. Tim Shipman, the editor of the Sunday Times, said to me before I went, "For the Lord's sake, Eleanor, take a lot of questions." And when I got there, I realised what he meant, because I started asking her questions, and you'd literally say, "So tell me about your childhood." And she'd go, "It was happy." And I got to the point where I was going, "So, did you do ballet? Did you ride?" It was like pulling teeth. So when we got to the picture shoot, to the photo shoot, and she came down in this pair of leather trousers, I absolutely whooped for joy, because I realised at that point that we had a story. And the real story behind the leather trousers was that they were far too short. They'd just arrived on a courier, and I don't think she'd ever worn them before. So we couldn't photograph her standing up in the leather trousers, because she was so short. Her legs were the wrong length. So we had to shoot her sitting down on the sofa. And then, of course, this huge kerfuffle blew up about whether anyone should be spending £1,000 on leather trousers, and was that right? And it was strange to me, because she was so careful in everything that she said, and then she ended up absolutely shooting herself in the foot through her choice of dress, which is a lesson to all of us ladies in the public eye. So let's move on to Broadwater Farm, which is much closer to what everybody's interested in this evening. This picture, Summer on the Farm, was how we introduced the spread in the Sunday Times magazine. And when I as the editor of the magazine, when you get the pictures in, it's really exciting. You send off the reporter on a story, and then you get the photographs, and it begins to come together, and you think about how you're going to display that as an editor. And I love this picture because I thought that it gave a great sense of Broadwater Farm and what it was like. And we ran it about almost exactly a year ago this week. And it was basically a really in-depth look at what was going on the Broadwater Farm Estate, which of course became notorious in the 80s when Keith Blakelock was stabbed to death by a mob. And then, of course, with Mark Duggan's shooting, there were more riots there. So it's always been a bit of a kind of hotbed, and it's also become a real magnet for poverty in Tottenham, which of course is a very poor borough. So I sent Sharon Hendry, who's a very gifted reporter, up there to find out what was going on. And she, interestingly, in the context of West London Action for Children, is a child psychotherapist, or she's training to be. She's been a journalist for a long time, and she went up there and we talked to a lot of their families and their children. So it was this picture particularly, which is coming up, which was the not just the bedroom and the kitchen, but the home of a family of 6 people. There was a mum and dad and 4 kids living in this room. And I have to say that you're used to seeing pictures like this kind of from the third world, but the idea that there were families in London, only a few miles away from our office, living like this, we found really shocking. And there's another photograph which shows the children's school timetables on the wall. So you could see that even though this family were living in such a terrible place, they were really, really trying to do the best by their kids. There was a kind of homework schedule. You could see all their kind of sports kits were laid out. These were people who were really trying hard. This is another family who, again, were living in a quite dilapidated one-room place. I think there were another 3 kids here, again, a family living in a single room. So I was so shocked when I saw those pictures that I went up to Broadwater Farm myself. I think it's very important as an editor and I started off as a reporter, to sometimes go and see some things yourself. And we got up there on the day that this is a special kind of a play day. This is like the carnival for them. This is the end of the summer term, and the headmistress had they'd raised special money. They'd raised £200 so that the children could have kind of bubbles and tea and kind of fun and games and running around in the street outside the school. And for a lot of the children, this was what they looked forward to most, because most of them dread the summer holidays because they were cooped up in these very dilapidated flats for most of the time, because it was very dangerous to be outside. There were a lot of gangs on the estate. The local park, I have to say, I felt very intimidated being there, even with the headmistress. But I went there on this day, which was this kind of very special day. And I said to the headmistress, who you can see here on the right, she's called Dawn Ferdinand, how could we help? Because I was so shocked by the pictures. And so in the Sunday Times magazine that weekend, we ran the story of the children, which has got some amazing quotes, mostly about how they dreaded the summer holidays, which, as the kind of parent of two girls myself, the idea that children would dread summer seemed to me completely wrong. Most children you talk to are saying, oh, I can't wait to go to the seaside, or we're going camping. Or these children, when you ask them what they were most looking forward to over the summer, said things like, well, my parents might be able to take me swimming if I'm really good. And that was like the one thing that they were doing. And when you said to them, if you could do anything, what would you do? They said things like, oh, well, it'd be amazing to go camping, or maybe we could go to Whipsnade. And the kind of poverty of their aspirations and about what they thought actually might be possible in their lives, I thought was one of the saddest things. So when we were putting the piece together to send it off to press, I wrote this little box, which you can see here on the right, which says, how can you help? And I'll just read out to you what I said. So I said, the thought that a child might dread the summer holidays was so shocking in 2019 that the Sunday Times magazine asked the head teacher of Willow Primary School what could be done to help. Dawn Ferdinand said that if we could raise some money, the school would be able to organise a series of trips and events in time for the holiday. This is last summer holidays. And the way we said it doesn't take much to fund these trips, and they'll give the children something to look forward to rather than dread. And I wanted to make the context that a century ago, philanthropic organisations in the capital would arrange for poor children to be able to go out to the countryside. They'd taken the city children out of London for the summer. And I was saying maybe our readers at the Sunday Times could do something like that for these children. So we made a list to give people an idea of what the money might buy. So we said £200 would take a group of 30 children swimming. 250 quid would support a street play event like the one you saw in the previous picture. £285 would take a group trampolining. £300 they could go to an art gallery or a museum. 800 quid they could take a group to the seaside. 1,600 to a UK safari park, that kind of thing. And what we were really wanting to do was to be able to keep the school open, because these schools in deprived areas, as I'm sure a lot of you know, are acting as a kind of fourth emergency service for these parents. That for a lot of the children, the only time they feel safe is when they're at school. It's when they get fed, they have responsible adults around them, things aren't chaotic, it's not dangerous. And so school for them was a real salvation, a refuge. And so when the schools shut for the summer, they were often very hungry, the kids, they had nothing to do, they were quite scared. Often the parents were going out to work, so that they were cooped up in these flats, often by themselves or being looked after by an older sibling for the whole of the summer. So I was just really shocked by this, and I thought that our readers would be too. And as the editor, I took the decision to run it in early July, because I thought that would be exactly, or I think it was the end of June, I thought that would be exactly when a lot of Sunday Times readers would be paying for little Johnny or Tamsin to be going to Pony Club, or they would be off to the south of France, or they would be going for tennis lessons, or they'd be heading off to Devon, or all the kind of, quite normal middle class things, and that they would be really shocked that these children really had nothing. So that was my hunch. So we put in this little panel, and I was literally thinking that we might raise a few £1,000s. I thought if we could raise £5,000, £10,000, then we could, Glassford, the community football organiser who runs the community centre, who'd been laid off because of the council cuts, could maybe run a few sessions for the children, and that they would have something to do over the summer. So to cut a long story short, by breakfast time on the day that this piece went public, we'd raised £50,000. And by the end of that week, we'd raised £350,000. So we did a Just Giving link so that people could donate money more easily, because Sunday Times had a paywall. And we did a big social media campaign. So the local MP, David Lammy, shared what we'd done, and it got real momentum on social media, and people were saying, this is a great campaign, these are children who are dreading the holidays. This was the kind of phrase around the campaign, the children who dread the holidays, and what can we do to try and give them a better time. And I was absolutely amazed, and I have to say, as a journalist, I was so thrilled, because it was really a sense of storytelling, making a difference, and making a difference to these children's lives. And we raised, as I say, we raised £350,000 by the end of the first week. And we went back to the school. They had so many checks and so many people ringing up that they couldn't handle it. But this was the moment. So this is Dawn Ferdinand, the head teacher, surrounded by the children. And this is when she told them that we'd raised all this money and that they were going to be able to go camping that summer. So this isn't saying they can go to the south of France. This is saying we're going to take you camping. And for most of the children, they'd never, or lots of them hadn't really been off the estate. The absolute majority had never been camping before. And they were told that they were all going to go camping. We did. They went off for a few nights to a special campsite, which we helped them organise. And the children were just so excited. And on top of that, we kept the school open. We paid to keep the school open for the whole of the summer. And they got a whole load of volunteers. And they ran breakfast clubs and lunch and incredible activities, bicycling and trampolining, and they took the kids to Whipsnade and all sorts of places for that summer, which was amazing. And there was also, of course, £350,000 paid for a lot of camping trips. So they've also created a fund, which means that these kids, and it wasn't just kids in this school either, it was lots of the other children on the estate also got involved, and the vulnerable children from schools around the area, and they all benefited. So they were allowed to go to the Willow Open School during the summer, and a lot of them went on a lot of the trips. And then there were some individual families. There was one family who had 2 disabled children who'd never been on holiday before, and we paid for them to have a week in a Butlins. And we kept reporting back to our readers about what their money was paying for, where it was going, where they were going, how it was working. And we got, it was one of the nicest things was we got all these incredible pictures from the children. They were so pleased. So look, this is one saying, thank you everyone, thank you so much for your donation, we're going to have a great summer and it's all down to you. And we kept running kind of updates in the magazine and online at the Sunday Times. So as a journalist, I've been involved in quite a lot of campaigns, but I have to say that this one was particularly special. And what we learned from it was that if you get the right ask and you communicate to your readers in the right way and you show them the reality of people's lives without kind of resorting to the kind of jargon that's often talked about when these issues are raised, you can break through people's compassion fatigue and, you know, their sense that maybe it's somebody else's problem or someone else should be doing something to help. And it really empowered the readers, because it wasn't just that you gave them a depressing read. As an editor, you run something, say, really grim about, say, the Yazidi women and what happened to them with ISIS, or I ran a story, I remember, you know, running some very grim stories from around the world, and you'd get to the end of it and you just feel a real sense of, God, that's terrible, but what can I do about it? But there was something about this piece, because it was so visceral and it was so clear. And Sharon Hendry, the journalist who did it, had been so brilliant about winning people's trust. And we went back to them with all the kind of quotes that we were going to use, and we showed them the pictures, and we really had them on side for what we were doing. And Dawn Ferdinand, the headmistress, had come from a very similar, very kind of poor background herself. And she gave a whole assembly to the school about how there was no shame in being poor, and that by doing this article with us, they were going to make so many children's lives better, and really explain to them how to think about it. So it was a real coordinated attempt. It wasn't a kind of swoop in by a journalist, whereby where it can sometimes feel a bit like a drive-by shooting. People kind of turn up, they kind of tell your story, and then you never hear from them again. We wanted to go in with a real sense that we were telling the community's story with their permission, that they had agency and control over how that was done, that they knew exactly what we were going to do. And that's why I think it was very important for me as the editor to actually go up there. And it was because I went and met the headmistress and I met the community organisers and I walked around the estate and I really saw it for myself, that I thought, actually, this isn't just a story about what's going on here. We can make it a story with an ask, which will also make the readers feel better about what they've read. And it worked beyond my wildest dreams. I was we were all incredibly thrilled by it. And my whole team at the Sunday Times, I had a very young team, and they were so delighted, and they were all like, this is what we came into journalism to do. This really matters. So, and then it had been such a success that I was speaking to the kind of high ups I was the editorial director, so I was speaking to my editor at the Sunday Times and also to the broader bosses at News UK about the Sunday Times Christmas appeal and what we might do for that, building on the success of what we've done at Broadwater Farm. And I wanted to take that microcosm and make it into a much broader national campaign. So we went up to, we decided to make it national, and we partnered with an organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation, which is run by the Sutton Trust. and they support children in the what are ironically called opportunity areas, which basically mean the 12 areas in Britain which have the least opportunities, and 8 of the poorest places in the country are in Blackpool. So we kicked it off in Blackpool, and on the left here you can see this was the cover of the Sunday Times magazine, Help Make Their Christmas a Happy One. And this was a little girl who we met in her primary school up in Blackpool. And again, I went with the reporter while we went up there to fix this campaign, because it was incredibly difficult to win the trust of the head teachers in these places. We were saying that we can raise some money, but they were very worried about their children and how, because they have a real duty of care to them, and how they were going to be portrayed and what we were going to do. And so we really went up and won the trust of the communities and explained to them what we were trying to do. And this little boy on the right is called Arlo, with his mummy, Naomi, and he'd been born with a collapsed lung and had all sorts of terrible breathing problems. And they were living in a very damp and dilapidated flat in a really run down bit of Blackpool. And this girl was only 19 or 20. She had 2 other children. She was having to get the bus to hospital with Arlo several times a week. They had absolutely no money at all, and they were basically being kept going by the school, who were giving them food parcels, had gone round with a Christmas tree, and it was very. I love this picture because it was so hard to get this woman to pose with her baby. She was very self-conscious. She didn't want to be photographed, and we spent a whole morning sitting in her sitting room and talking to Arlo and talking to her, and we had a very lovely gentle photographer. And finally she said, oh, okay, you can do it. And he said, look, you can see exactly what the image is. And we ended up with this beautiful picture where I think she looks like a real it was like a Madonna and Child, and it was such a moving story. So that was that was our Christmas appeal, and again that was a huge success. So often at the Sunday Times we partnered with things like Save the Children, or we helped kind of children in Yemen, or it was always a bit further away. And I thought that doing something domestic and really trying to explain to the readers how the other half were living in the UK was really important. And of course the election campaign was going on as well, so it was really important to kind of steer away from politics and just tell people's personal stories, saying these are people who were doing their best in really terrible circumstances, and you can help them. So we raised the money so that there would be, again, schools kept open during the holidays, so that these very desperate families would have somewhere to go, and somewhere they could be warm and they would be fed. And we also created hampers. I think we gave out about 3,000 hampers across the UK to the various families. There were various Christmas parties. The children got presents. And it wasn't just money that the readers donated. HarperCollins, which is another part of the group, gave 1,000 children's books to all these schools. Aldi donated £4,000 worth of food parcels. We gave out £9,000 worth of fuel cards to the families so that they would be warm on Christmas Day. And again, we did a whole menu of things that people could fund and exactly what their money was going to pay for. So it was a real... Just Giving were also amazing. They put us on the top of their Christmas, on the top of their website. And in fact, both of these campaigns, Broadwater Farm and it wasn't just Blackpool, it was all these poorest areas in Britain, that raised nearly £2 million in the end, and which all went through Just Giving. And what was most touching to me were the comments of the people who donated. So the biggest donation was £38,000 from one person, and the smallest donation was £3. And there were people saying, I wish I could give more, but I think this is such an amazing campaign. I'm so glad that you're doing this, and that these people really need it, and they really appreciated the way that we told the stories. So I think that the moral of it is that even through the kind of massive noise and cacophony of the media, and particularly on social media where there are millions of posts all the time, you can cut through if you tell the stories in the right way, if you get people to cooperate with you, and if the people who you're talking to and dealing with really believe that you are doing this in their best interest, and that you have absolutely their dignity at heart, and that you're not trying to exploit them in any way. And I think the journalists can often have a bit of a bad name, and therefore trying to get that balance between really emotive storytelling, which is not exploitative, is absolutely crucial. And Sharon Hendry, who was the journalist, was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize this year for these reports. And I have to say, in my 20 years in Fleet Street as it was, or being an editor, these are the two campaigns that I really am proudest of. And when I left the Sunday Times, I felt so delighted that I'd been able to use the platform that I had there to really make a difference to all of these families. So Laurence.
Yes, let me come back into view there.
Hang on, let me stop the share and then we can, there we are. Better.
There we go. Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was a fascinating insight into really the power that an editor can have, and from being, taking a very human approach to wanting to get up close and personal, to see it for yourself, in other words. And of course, those of us who spend our lives thinking about how to make life better for those, who are suffering in society, we're often frustrated at the perceived lack of, or actual lack of understanding and comprehension that policymakers often seem to display, or just sheer ignorance of people's lived experiences. And you have demonstrated, and it's quite rare actually to get that close and to really get into the lives and under the skin of people who are marginalized.
Yes, and it's really difficult because they know that they're marginalized, and a lot of them feel a huge amount of shame about their circumstances. So part of the reason the lovely mum of the very sick baby didn't want to be photographed because she felt so ashamed of her house and the fact that she had this sick child and she was living in this place and she was doing her best, but she didn't want to reveal that. And it was a really, really difficult balance to get people to tell you the kind of things which will then make people donate. And you did it very brilliantly with your Bedrooms of London campaign, where you really get a sense of the actual detail and the kind of visceral nature of these people's lives and what they're doing with. And when I sat in Blackpool talking to some of these families, I thought, I'm quite a resourceful lady, but I don't know if I don't think I would be doing as well as Natalie was when she was trying to take this baby to hospital and they had absolutely no money at all. She was so patient and so sweet with them. And I thought that when a lot of people judge people who are on the margins, it's that old thing of, walk a mile in another man's shoes before you come to any kind of a judgment. And I left Blackpool feeling truly humbled. I really did, by what these people were going through. And I thought it was a kind of honor to be able to tell their stories in a way that really reflected the truth of what was going on.
No, absolutely. One of the things that springs to mind is, in terms of a question, and for those of you listening, watching, do ask questions, use the Q&A function. We've got a couple that have come in already, not as many as we want, so get asking questions. Eleanor, I wanted to ask you, is how much do you think, you mentioned the words compassion fatigue. We've gone through, a historic crisis with this coronavirus pandemic. Yeah. And there's been an outpouring of community spirits. We're all in it together, all this kind of thing. The NHS, the care homes, people really have a sense of that we have gone through something. We have gone through this together. And of course, enormous sums have been raised. Do you think that this is sustainable? Are things irreparably changed? Or are we going to revert back very quickly to where we've come from?
Well, I think the real horror of lockdown is that if you were in a reasonably good situation to begin with, if you live in a nice place and you're quite happy in your family life and you have enough money to not have to worry about being able to go to the shops and buy the food that you need, then lockdown for a lot of us has been quite fun. There's been a lot less, I'm not exactly fun, but it's been a lot less stressful. There have been some good things about it. I mean, I know a lot of people who say, actually, I quite like the kind of the peace of the lockdown and the kind of spending more time with family and all those kind of things. But all the time, I think one's aware that if you're living in, I've been haunted a lot of this lockdown by those pictures of those families in Broadwater Farm, having been around those flats or sat with people in Blackpool. And I think it must have been hell, that period when it was incredibly hot. and these people were stuck in dilapidated, you know, stinking, small, hot rooms set with 4 or 5 children and no money to go out and nowhere to go, even if you did go out. And this idea that everybody's been sitting in their gardens. Well, you know, lovely if you're kind of Boris Johnson with checkers and a huge great garden, or you're kind of rich enough to have a garden. But wasn't it 2/3 of people in the UK don't have a garden? So it's that kind of sense. It's that sense that if you were okay to begin with, then your lockdown's probably been okay. And I think for the most marginalised, it's been pretty appalling. And for anyone who's in a situation with domestic violence, which we know has rocketed, or people who are losing their jobs or who couldn't work and don't have savings, you know, it's been probably about as bad as it could possibly be. And then you add on to that the stress of people being ill and the massive incidence of higher incidence of COVID in a lot of our poorest communities and people from BAME backgrounds. And you get a real perfect storm where the haves have actually had quite a nice lockdown and the have-nots have had an absolutely horrendous time. I mean, a lot of the I was lucky enough to attend your webinar for your charity, which was really giving an insight into what people's lives have been like, and it's absolutely dreadful. And I think that we have a kind of responsibility to remember that a lot of people are having a terrible time. So, you know, yes, there's been an outpouring, like all that clapping for the NHS, and we're all in this together and these are all our heroes. But the reality is that it's very, very different. It's been very, very different for a lot of people out there. And I think most people who are living quite comfortable lives haven't really kind of thought about that much at all.
No, and as we, you know, the economic impact of this pandemic begins to make itself known, because I don't think we've fully felt that yet. Do you think that the reportage will change, the coverage will change, the editorial positions will start to shift? What's your view on that?
Well, to be fair, I think that the coverage has been pretty bad. I was ill myself. I had what was probably COVID at the beginning of March, just when Boris went into intensive care. I was ill myself, and I thought, I mean, I'm a journalist. I've been a news junkie my entire life, and I couldn't watch any of the news bulletins. I found it filled me with so much anxiety that I couldn't sleep, and I found a lot of the coverage extremely kind of mawkish and unhelpful, and lots of really terrible kind of personal stories where there wasn't a sense of anything that you could do to help. It was like a kind of parade of misery. And I think that what I'm trying to say about these articles and the way that we told these stories was, if you just present to people total grimness and despair with no possibility of any kind of solution, I think they switch off. And it's what I know as a journalist and as an editor. Whereas if you say these people are living these terribly difficult lives, but if you do this thing, you can help them, I think that you then get an incredible response. I think most of the British public aren't horrible and aren't really that selfish. And if you explain it to them in a way that they can relate to, they'll do the right thing. But I don't actually think that a lot of the reporting around COVID has been like that. I think it's been quite odd. And looking at it also for the first time in 2 decades, not as a practicing hack, but as a kind of as a much more of a punter, I thought it was absolutely dreadful, and I've kind of disconnected from it a lot. So I think that these arguments about how you tell stories so that people can empathise and engage and you don't massively put them off have never been more important.
No, absolutely. And just following on from that, do you see, you know, the importance of the media in general as acting as a kind of bridge to reality, rather than a, you know, and how the function of that, the importance of that? You know, what do you see? Do you see that as a bigger role to play in the future?
I think, again, we've got a real problem, because the issues that are affecting the media at the moment are, as we see, not just in newspapers, but particularly on Facebook and those kind of things. I saw stuff talking about Palo Alto. It's the effect of the algorithm, or the effect of social media, is that the person who shouts loudest, who has the most extreme position, is the person who gets the most clicks. And it's why you get an erosion of the centre ground of their political debate. Because I talked about this at the Cannes Advertising Festival kind of last year, and we were talking about how the more extreme the content, the more clicks you get, and therefore the more money Facebook makes by auctioning your click. You know, every time you click, there's an auction for what ad they're going to serve you up, and they make more and more money. So the more extreme discourse becomes, the more extreme things that are put on social media, the more the algorithms become profitable. So you're kind of incentivizing not just fake news, but the most extreme and kind of appalling interpretation of anything. And that goes for, you know, things like COVID as well as other kinds of reporting. So you've got a perfect storm where 90% of all the online advertising, this is my editorial director head on, but 90% of all the online advertising was going to Google and Facebook. The print advertising was completely going down the, you know, going downhill really fast anyway because of the shift to digital. But newspapers were not making back that money. And the problem is that whatever you think of journalists, democracy, in a democracy, you need news that you can trust so that people can make decisions about how they're going to vote and what politicians are doing. And when the discourse becomes more and more polarized and the more extreme story is the only one which gets attention, you have a real problem. You have kind of truth basically falling into a kind of cavity in the middle, and more of the organizations who are supposed to be doing the reporting which we rely on not being able to afford to do it. I mean, all the newspaper groups recently have announced big job cuts, and that means less people with the time to actually go and do the kind of careful reporting which is necessary for people to understand the issues. I mean, this story for the Sunday Times, I went up to Blackpool for a week. I paid Sharon Hendry several times to go back to up to Tottenham. It costs a lot of money to do proper reporting. And at the moment, the business model of the news organisations does not in any way respect that function. So what you're getting is cheaper and cheaper, more and more kind of more slipshod or kind of reporting people are doing from their desks or by looking at Google, and less actually going out and talking to people and reporting back on the issues. And that is a real problem. And it's something that is not going to be resolved soon. It's getting worse all the time.
Well, that's
on that depressing note.
A happy note. I don't know, but listen, at least we're aware of this, and these are you know, people are talking about these things, and you're not the first person that I've heard say that, and I think there is an awareness, and you've demonstrated, and others, the power the media does have in playing a role in representing the very, you know, most vulnerable, the poorest, the weakest in society, and I think that actually strengthens the media's hand, and it brings people along with you, and it creates audiences, and it retains audiences, and it provides the polar opposite to the worst excesses of social media. And you know, people want authenticity, they want to see reality, they want to see stories that matter to them in their communities. And
but the problem is if they want that, they're going to have to pay for it.
Well, this is the thing, yeah.
Because the old model, the old bundle of newspapers was, we take your advertising, you know, Mr. Boots or Mr. Washing Up Liquid, or, you know, or Mrs. whatever it is, you know, cars, houses. And it used to be that it would, so I mean, this is a very old figure, but it used to be that we sold the Sunday Times for £2.50, but it cost £6 to produce each edition by the time because there were all the magazines and things. And the gap was filled by advertising, because it was so profitable, it was taking so much money in advertising, that actually the cover price wasn't even really representative of how much the newspaper was costing. And of course, as that advertising has declined, and the Enders Analysis has just done a report saying that some newspapers have seen a decline in advertising of 80% during COVID, and a circulation cut as well. And so the kind of cumulative effect of that is less money to do the kinds of reporting which is really necessary.
No, absolutely. And you know, the interesting dilemma to consider is the new generation, you know, the children, my child, 14, yeah. Your child, you know, are they reading newspapers? Are they going to consume media in the same way that we did?
Well, what I find relatively encouraging about that is that my children will pay for some media. So the key to all of this is that we have to accept that if we want to live in a democracy which holds people to account and tells the stories that matter, as consumers, we're going to have to pay for that journalism, that it's a cost. It's not necessarily, it's not something that you can get on kind of clickbait for free, that somebody has to pay for it. But what I do think is interesting is that both I've got teenage girls, 17 and 15, and both of them pay for their own Spotify subscription. So
Yeah,
it's not
my
that they,
son's 14. He pays for his too. Yeah.
exactly. So we used to go out, and I'm so old. We used to go out and kind of, you know, buy records. I remember going to kind of Woolworths, and you know, you buy a single. It was really exciting, and you kind of take it home. So they will pay for music. So they'll pay so they can have all their playlists and all those kind of things. And I pay for Netflix for the whole family, but I think that they would also pay for Netflix if the alternative was not having it. So I think that there is actually, I think, and the statistics show that there's a kind of bulge in the middle who are about in between 30 and 40 who think that everything online should be free and don't really want to pay for everything, for anything. But actually the younger generation understand that if they want quality or they want things the way they want it, then they'll have to pay for it. And there's been some encouraging things, like the New York Times, I think, has put on 1 million subscriptions during lockdown, which people are paying for. But the problem is that you end up with a very kind of overeducated, or you end up with a very informed elite, and democracy suffers because most people are getting fake or sloppy news. So there's a kind of, I think there's a huge argument which needs to be made on the importance of news, whether that's BBC News or newspapers or wherever you're getting it from, but that journalism matters, and that tried and kind of tested and information which has been stress tested is a hard thing to get. I mean, the old adage, news is something that someone somewhere doesn't want you to know. You don't find out news by looking at press releases or looking at Google. You find it out by truffling around and sniffing out the things that people would rather that you didn't know. And that's a skill.
Absolutely. Well, some of the questions, we've got some good questions coming in now. Some
Okay.
meaty questions. So there's a couple around a similar theme, which you're going to get in 2 seconds. I'm going to read this out verbatim, so there's no bias here.
Oh, gosh.
There is no shame in being poor. You worked for one of the most wealthy and powerful families in the world, and they are often perceived as not being on the side of the more marginalized in society. Do you think that's a fair reflection of the Murdochs? That's the first question. The second one, along the same theme, it answers itself now. The HBO series Succession, which media family do you think it might be based on? So there's 2 questions there for you to
okay, I knew that I was going to have to tackle the horror subject of Rupert, KRM as he was known in the business. There are, and lots of people have been watching this BBC series, which is pretty grisly to watch. All I can say is that as an editor on the Sunday Times, that we had a very strict editorial board between kind of us and the rest of News Corp, and I was never told what I could or couldn't run. And so the fact that I ran these stories about the poorest people in the UK and raised this money, as an editor, that was my idea. I put that up. I went and did that. I was the editorial director of the paper. I was allowed to make that decision. And I've campaigned not just around child poverty, but around all sorts of controversial issues during the 20 years that I worked for News UK. Whether that was around, while I was a columnist on the Sunday Times, I became very interested in female genital mutilation and how there hadn't been a single prosecution in the UK and that nobody was looking at it, and it had become kind of something that we were allowing to happen. And I went and did a lot of reporting about, there were actually 3,000 cases being turning up for a particular midwife, a particular trust in Birmingham, of women who'd been cut in the UK, that this wasn't something that was happening in Africa, it was happening here. And I persuaded my then editor, it was a very male team, that this really mattered. And we put it on the front page of the Sunday Times, we ran an editorial, it was a huge thing. And it really shifted the political weather. David Cameron started talking about it, it became a mainstream issue. Prior to that, you'd only ever seen it kind of on the women's pages of The Guardian, and it was whispered about. And I remember when I first went to talk to my editor about it, he was, the news editor was meant to talk to him about it, and he was too embarrassed to actually have the conversation with the editor about it. So I went in with all the diagrams, because I'd been up to speak to the midwife in Birmingham, and I was like, okay, this is what it's about. You've got daughters. This is what it's about. This is not okay. This is happening in the UK. Yes, I totally don't defend Rupert Murdoch on lots of things. Fox News, I'm on the record hating Page 3 and speaking out against The Sun often. But that didn't stop me being an effective editor on the Sunday Times for a very long time, and people knew that I held those positions. And also, whatever you think about Rupert Murdoch, he's one of the few people who went on investing in newspapers when everybody else was disinvesting from them. The time, he was losing 50 million a year on the Times at one point. I've met him often during my editorial time there, and he really believes in stories, and he's interested in reporting, and he's gone on funding not just the kind of investigations that I've shown you here where we raise money for poor children, but also, say, I used to send Christina Lamb, who's a brilliant war correspondent, to Africa. She went and reported for me when I was at the magazine on the Boko Haram children who'd been abducted, and we went back 3 or 4 years on when no one else was looking at the story, and it cost us probably £20,000 to do that investigation because it was so dangerous where she was going and all the rest of it. And I don't think that there was any other newspaper group who had that kind of money to invest in journalism. So I'm absolutely not defending him on lots of other levels, but as a newspaper person, as someone who believes in journalism, he did fund stories that matter, and he paid journalists to do them in a way that a lot of more worthy sounding groups didn't have those kind of budgets at all. And as an editor on his newspapers, I was never told what I could or couldn't run.
No, well, that's very good. I mean, I've read Noam Chomsky and his theories, these framing theories, the kind of idea that it's not explicit, that the censorship, that it's implicit, that it's these. One knows the subjects and the taboos that that you don't kind of cross or break. But I think Eleanor, you clearly come across as someone with your own mind, and
well, I mean, Laurence, you know me well enough to know that I'm not a particularly controllable type. No. And also, if I'd been told that I couldn't do the right stories that I was interested in, I would have left.
Wouldn't have been there so long. And what it must be said, the first time we ever met, and you remembered this, I remembered it too. You were wrapping Christmas presents with your daughter for very poor children, and that was done completely. You put your own money there, you bought stuff, you did this, and there was no story in that for you. It was. No,
I think I did. I think it was. I met you when we were at Kids Company, and because I was a long-term supporter of what Camilla Batman-Galich was doing to try and help the poorest kids in the country. I mean, this has been something that this isn't a flash in the pan for me. I've been trying to tell the stories of the most marginalised people in this country for 2 decades, and okay, I will admit that my politics weren't necessarily the politics of a lot of other people on the paper, but I was an allowed rebel. I wasn't told that I couldn't do that. There were lots of different voices that made up those newspapers, and so you might have somebody like Rod Liddle on one side, but you also had people like me or Yasmin Alibi Brown, who I hired, who was one of the first paying columnists on the newspaper, who I hired, and I brought in lots and lots of different kinds of voices that people wouldn't necessarily have expected within the Murdoch press. But it was a much broader church than most people from the outside give it credit for, and I wouldn't have stayed there so long if I hadn't genuinely felt that.
And you touched on something there. Is white privilege still a thing? Is it a big problem in the media? Are we
massive? It's a massive problem. In fact, watch this space, because one of my other heads that I wear is I'm chair of something called Women in Journalism, and I have we've just done a huge research project looking at quite how bad and how white and how undiverse the UK media is. We've got a big piece of research which is going to land in about 3 weeks. I've seen the headlines on it. We've been doing a kind of monitoring exercise, and it is in no way representative. I mean, I'm a firm believer. I've been banging the drum for more women in senior positions in not just in the Murdoch press, but across the media for 2 decades, and we've now got 8 out of 15 editors are women. So that has been quite a successful shift. But the next revolution that needs to happen is on representation, because I have a real feeling that the media needs to be a truly reflecting lens, a truly reflecting mirror. It needs to be inhabited by the same kinds of people who are that you're writing about or that you're reading about, so that people see themselves truly reflected in the things that you write. And if it becomes a distorting lens when all the people making the decision are white, posh men. That's what it used to be. Now there are quite a few white posh women as well, not necessarily the same. That's a great thing either, but when I first started, I would often sit in rooms and I would be the only woman at the table, and people would turn to me and go, "Oh, Eleanor, what do women think?" You go, "Well, I can tell you what I think, but I'm actually not representative of all women." So that has shifted, but now we need the same paradigm shift, because most of those rooms there was nobody who wasn't white, and very few people increasingly from a more kind of working class background, because of the ways into the media. So the Sutton Trust said something like 70% of journalists have been to private school, and that is not representative. If we're going to have a democracy that works and a media which reflects who we really are, then it's got to be more representative. And the research that we're about to bring out will show how bad it is. It's terrible. It's shocking.
Yeah, no, I mean, I read a wide variety of media, and I definitely detect a lack of diversity and representation.
And we're not just looking at newspapers. We've looked at the 30 top news programs by audience. So these are the kind of the main places in the country, and the lack of diversity is shocking. And the other really terrible thing is what stories people are sent to write about. So it always used to be that women would be sent off to do health stories or education stories, or beauty, or you'd have to kind of go and try on some new frock or something. And we fought really hard for that. I mean, I've sat in so many conferences where I go up to the news editor at the end, or they used to get so sick of me. I'd be like, "Okay, you've got 3 women on this news list, and 2 have been murdered. One's been raped, one's been murdered, and one's there because she's married to somebody famous. Where's your woman with agency doing something in their own right?" And it's now even worse than that diversity, and we're beginning to see it. And I think that that's really important.
No, that's I mean, that's great to hear, Eleanor, and great to hear we've got a scoop tonight. You told us something that nobody else really knew. Yeah, so we'll look out for that.
Yeah. Gosh, you'll get me into trouble.
Yeah.
But no, I haven't given you any of the figures. It's the actual. I mean, everyone knows that it's unrepresentative, but when you really look at it in a granular way, it's really much worse than you think it is.
Yeah, well, we'll really look forward to seeing that. Right, we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to be wrapping up in a minute. Well, 2 more. Let's do it quickly. You did a brilliant job at the Sunday Times. It was a golden period for the newspaper. What papers do you respect and pick up regularly? Someone asked.
Oh, okay, interesting. I've just got myself a subscription to the New York Times, which is actually surprisingly cheap. It's only about like $4 a month or something, rather cheaper than my old organ. And I love it. I think that a lot of the reporting in it is great. So New York Times I really like. I think the FT is very good at the moment. Rula Khalaf, the new editor, who was born in Lebanon, a woman, a brown woman in charge of the FT, is quite something, and I think she's one of the most charismatic and interesting figures in media today. So I think FT, New York Times. I mean, I have a bit of an addiction to the Daily Mail online, just because you've got to know what they're thinking.
Yeah, we're guilty.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that. And and there are bits of the Guardian I like too. So I still kind of find myself reading it. And I actually quite like The Spectator. I have a digital subscription to The Spectator. I mean, the idea you have been a media pressure for a long time is the wider the range of stuff that you read, and the more you get yourself out of your Twitter bubble, the better. And it's really important to read people who you don't necessarily agree with. And other kind of for long reads, I love The Atlantic. I think that's really good if you're going to get a subscription to something, and The New Yorker. I used to love the New York Review of Books, but it's got a bit more boring.
Yeah, it's a bit highbrow there. Yeah. So, right, we're going to wrap up now. There's not a question; it's just a comment from one of our audience. I want to cheer. Wonderfully passionate talk, channeling Carly and full of compassion and heart. You've captured the fine balance between the meaningful and emotive, with an absence of exploitation. Well done.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. I mean, I have to say that I've now left journalism. I'm still chair of Women in Journalism, but I'm not intending to kind of go back into newspapers. So I feel really touched that people have have related so much to these stories, and that we raised so much money for people who really deserved it. And I hope that in some way I can go on using that campaigning mindset in what I do next.
Absolutely, Eleanor. And like I said, we'll be having a coffee very, very soon. So thank you for that marvelous, marvelous talk. And to everyone that enjoyed this, please spare a thought for those children and families that you saw in those pictures tonight, and the tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of people living in poverty, struggling with anxiety, with depression, with suicidal thoughts, and the many other emotional and psychological difficulties that West London Action for Children's work addresses. Their vital work, their critical work, because as we know, the adolescent child mental health services are not able to cope with all those children and adolescents that need support. So West London Action for Children's work is absolutely vital and critical in supporting those that need it. So please, if you're feeling generous, make a small donation, make that a monthly donation. Go to West London Action for Children's website, and even just £2 or £3, £4, £5 a month would make an incredible difference to their work and support them in the long term. Children don't need, many children need long-term support, 6 months plus to be restored to good functioning. And that is transformative. That changes lives. So please think of how you can help. But before we finish completely, I'd like to tell you all about next week's brilliant talk, which again, I am hosting. And this will be, this will end the summer series. The inimitable Baroness Blower of Starch Green, there's a title for you, will discuss the virtues of education and gardening and the extent to which children in urban and suburban environments are cut off from the natural world. She will argue that much more should be done in schools and the environment and the climate crisis that we face. So thank you all for listening. We're ending a few minutes early there, but do look on West London Action for Children's website about the talk next week. Thank you all for your questions, for participating. Sorry, we might not have been able to answer all of them, but I think all the subjects were covered. And don't forget to donate, and see you all next week. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Eleanor. That was brilliant.
Great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, West London Action for Children. All the best. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.